16th of January, 1980. A cold winter evening settles over the quiet suburbs south of Denver, Colorado. The streets are calm. Snow sits along the edges of sidewalks. Most people are already home for the night, but one young woman is still on her way home. 21-year-old Helene Pruszynki has just stepped off a bus after a long day at work. The walk to her aunt's house in Englewood should take only a few minutes. She never makes it. By morning, Helene has vanished without a trace. Weeks later, her body is discovered in a remote field miles away. For decades, the case would haunt investigators. The killer had vanished, until nearly 40 years later, when a breakthrough in forensic science finally revealed the man responsible. And what investigators discovered would shock the community. Who was Helene Pruszynki? To understand the tragedy of this case, we first have to understand who Helene was. Helene Pruszynki grew up in the quiet coastal town of Hamilton, Massachusetts. Friends and family described her as intelligent, determined, and deeply curious about the world. From a young age, she loved storytelling. She had a fascination with journalism, especially radio broadcasting. The idea that voices could travel through the air and reach thousands of people fascinated her. Helene attended Wheaton College, where she studied communications. Her professors described her as driven and enthusiastic. She wasn't just studying journalism, she was preparing for a career in it. In 1980, she landed what felt like the opportunity of a lifetime, an internship at KHR Radio in Denver, Colorado. For a young, aspiring broadcaster, it was a huge step. Helene moved to Colorado temporarily to begin the internship, staying with relatives while she worked at the station. She was excited, optimistic, and ready to begin the career she had always dreamed of. But only days into that new chapter, everything would change. January 16, 1980, began as a completely normal day. Helene arrived at the radio station for her internship shift at KHR. She spent the day learning the ropes of radio journalism, observing, assisting, and soaking in every bit of experience she could. Later that afternoon, she left work slightly earlier than usual. Her plan was simple. She would take the bus toward her aunt's house in Englewood, then walk the short remaining distance. It was a routine she had followed before. Nothing seemed unusual. Helene boarded the bus and rode south toward the suburbs. As evening approached, she stepped off at her stop. From there, she had only a short walk left, just a few blocks, but somewhere along that walk, something terrible happened. Helene never arrived home. When hours passed with no sign of her, concern quickly grew. Her family and co-workers knew something wasn't right. Helene was responsible, dependable. She wouldn't simply disappear, but by the next morning, it became clear that something far more serious had happened. Helene Pruszynki was missing. For days, investigators searched for clues. Then, roughly 2 weeks later, the worst fears were confirmed. Helene's body was discovered in a remote field in Douglas County, Colorado. The discovery was devastating. Investigators determined that Helene had been abducted while walking from the bus stop. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Her body had then been left in the isolated field. The brutality of the crime shocked the community. Who would target a young woman simply walking home? And more importantly, where was the killer? Police launched an intensive investigation. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods near the bus stop. They interviewed witnesses. They looked for anyone who might have seen a suspicious vehicle or person that night. But information was scarce. There were no clear suspects, no reliable eyewitnesses. Investigators did collect physical evidence from the crime scene. But in 1980, forensic technology was still extremely limited. DNA testing as we know it today didn't exist. The evidence was preserved, but there was no way to identify the killer using it at the time. As weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. Despite the efforts of detectives, the case slowly began to grow cold. For Helene's family, the uncertainty was unbearable. They knew someone had taken her life, but that person was still out there. Years passed, then decades. Detectives revisited the case periodically, hoping new leads might appear, but none ever did. Eventually, investigators were able to develop a DNA profile from evidence collected in 1980. However, when they ran the DNA through criminal databases, nothing came back. The killer had never been caught for a crime that required DNA submission, which meant his identity remained unknown. For nearly 40 years, Helene's case remained one of Colorado's most haunting unsolved murders. Her family waited for answers, and investigators held on to one hope: that someday technology might catch up with the evidence. The breakthrough. That moment finally arrived decades later. In the late 2010s, a new investigative technique began solving cold cases across the United States: genetic genealogy. Instead of searching criminal databases for exact DNA matches, investigators could upload DNA profiles to genealogy databases and search for relatives of the suspect. Even distant cousins could lead detectives to the killer. Investigators working Helene's case decided to try this new technology. They uploaded the unknown DNA profile, and slowly, a family tree began to emerge. From there, detectives started narrowing down possible suspects. Eventually, one name stood out: a man who had lived in Colorado in 1980, a man with a disturbing criminal history. His name was James Curtis Clanton. The killer revealed James Curtis Clanton had a long criminal past. Years earlier, he had been convicted of rape. In fact, he had been on parole at the time Helene was murdered in 1980. Investigators discovered that Clanton had been living in Colorado during that period. Later in life, he moved to Florida and worked as a truck driver. Detectives knew they needed a DNA sample to confirm their suspicions, but they couldn't simply ask him for it, so they began watching him. In 2019, investigators followed Clanton to a bar in Florida. While he was there, he drank from a beer glass. When he left, detectives collected the glass. The DNA on the rim was sent to the lab. When the results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA matched the evidence from Helene's murder. After nearly 40 years, investigators had finally found the killer. The arrest. In 2019, police arrested James Curtis Clanton. He was extradited back to Colorado to face justice. During questioning, Clanton eventually admitted to the crime. He confessed that he had abducted Helene at knife point as she walked home from the bus stop. He forced her into his vehicle, then drove her to the remote field where the crime occurred. There, he sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her to death. Afterward, he left her body in the field and disappeared into the night. For decades, he had lived freely, while Helene's family waited for answers. The trial. In 2020, Clanton faced the legal consequences of his actions. Because the crime occurred in 1980, the case was governed by the laws in place at that time. This created complicated legal limitations. Kidnapping charges were eventually dropped. Sexual assault charges could not be filed due to statutes of limitation. But the most serious charge remained: first-degree murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Clanton pleaded guilty. For Helene's family, the confession finally brought answers they had waited decades to hear. The court sentenced James Curtis Clanton to life in prison. However, due to Colorado's sentencing laws from 1980, he would technically be eligible for parole after serving 20 years. Even so, the conviction represented something Helene's family had been denied for decades: justice. Nearly 40 years after the crime, the man responsible had finally been held accountable. The case had a powerful impact on the Colorado community. For many investigators, solving the murder became one of the most meaningful moments of their careers. Detectives who worked the case said they felt they were finally speaking for a victim who had waited far too long. Helene's family expressed relief that the mystery had finally been solved. Though nothing could bring her back, knowing the truth mattered. The case also became a powerful example of how modern forensic science can solve crimes once thought impossible. Genetic genealogy has since helped solve hundreds of cold cases across the country, and Helene's case was one of the earliest examples of its success. Helene Pruszynki was only 21 years old. She had dreams of becoming a journalist, a life full of promise, a future just beginning. But one violent encounter took everything away. For decades, her killer believed he had gotten away with murder. But time has a way of catching up with the truth. Advances in science and the persistence of investigators finally revealed the answer, nearly 40 years later, because sometimes justice may be delayed, but it is never completely out of reach. If you're drawn to the truth behind the headlines, you're in the right place. This is CSV Crime Story Vault. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, hit like and leave a comment below. And for exclusive updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more real crime stories, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Crime Story Vault 25. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and keep the vault open.